Strait of Hormuz, the narrow gate through which 1/5 of the world's oil must pass. For millennia, merchants and mariners have navigated a narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean, a waterway that has witnessed the flow of silk, spices, and precious goods since ancient times. Today, that same strait carries something far more vital to modern civilization, approximately 1/5 of the world's oil consumption. The Strait of Hormuz, stretching approximately 167 kilometers between Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south, represents the single most critical energy choke point on Earth. At its narrowest point, the strait measures just 48 kilometers wide, yet through this confined passage flows the lifeblood of the global economy. In 2024, an average of 20 million barrels of oil per day transited these waters, accounting for more than 1/4 of all seaborne oil trade worldwide. The numbers reveal the strait's extraordinary importance. Approximately 89% of the crude oil and condensate passing through is destined for Asian markets, while around 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade also navigates these waters. The strait's geography creates a natural bottleneck that cannot be easily bypassed. Ships navigate through two designated lanes, each just 3.2 kilometers wide, separated by a 3.2-kilometer buffer zone. The average depth reaches around 70 meters, with the shallowest navigational channel at approximately 71 meters, though depths exceed 200 meters near the Musandam Peninsula. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf, home to some of the world's largest oil reserves, to the Gulf of Oman and the broader Indian Ocean. Without it, the petroleum resources of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates would have no direct route to global markets. The strait's width varies from approximately 97 kilometers at its widest to just 39 kilometers, making it simultaneously indispensable and vulnerable. Any disruption here reverberates instantly across world energy markets, affecting prices from Tokyo to New York. The Strait of Hormuz has existed for thousands of years as a natural geographic feature carved by geological forces that separated the Arabian Peninsula from the Iranian plateau. A theory suggests the strait may have been named after Ifra Hormizd, the mother of King Shapur II of Persia, who ruled between 309 and 379 AD, though the waterway's significance predates even this ancient era. For centuries, the strait served as the gateway between the vast hinterlands rich in luxury trade goods and the lucrative trading ports of the Indian Ocean world. Babur, the first Padishah of the Mughal Empire, documented the historical importance of trade through Hormuz in his memoirs, recognizing it as a center of maritime commerce connecting the Middle East with India and beyond. The strait's strategic value attracted European colonial powers in the age of exploration. Portuguese explorers first reached the Persian Gulf in 1507, and their ambitions quickly focused on controlling this vital passage. After capturing the small island of Hormuz, the Portuguese built a fortress and established a customs house to collect tolls from ships passing through the strait. This marked the beginning of what historians call the struggle for the Strait of Hormuz, a conflict primarily involving the Portuguese and Ottomans over control of this strategically vital waterway. The rivalry intensified throughout the early 16th century as both empires recognized that whoever controlled Hormuz controlled access to the riches of the Persian Gulf. The modern legal status of the strait evolved significantly in the 20th century. In 1959, Iran expanded its territorial sea to 22 kilometers, a move matched by Oman in 1972 when it also extended its territorial waters to 22 kilometers by decree. Thus, by 1972, the Strait of Hormuz was completely enclosed by the combined territorial waters of Iran and Oman, creating complex questions of international maritime law and transit rights that persist to this day. Chapter 3: Decades of Threats and Tensions. The transformation of the Strait of Hormuz from a historical trade route into a modern geopolitical flashpoint accelerated with the discovery of vast petroleum reserves throughout the Persian Gulf region. As oil became the dominant energy source of the 20th century, the strait's importance shifted from facilitating the spice trade to enabling the flow of millions of barrels of crude oil daily to energy-hungry economies worldwide. The first major crisis involving the strait as an oil choke point emerged during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. The tanker war phase began when Iraq attacked the oil terminal and oil tankers at Iran's Karg Island in early 1984. Saddam Hussein's strategic aim was to provoke the Iranians to retaliate with extreme measures, such as closing the Strait of Hormuz to all maritime traffic, which would have devastated global oil markets. However, Iran limited its retaliatory attacks to Iraqi shipping, leaving the strait open to international commerce despite the intense regional conflict. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Iran claimed authority over the Strait of Hormuz, and, throughout decades of tense relations with the United States, the Iranian regime repeatedly threatened to shut down the strait and plunge the global oil market into chaos. These threats highlighted a fundamental vulnerability in the global energy system. A single nation could potentially hold critical shipping lanes hostage and exert geopolitical pressure at relatively low cost. The lesson that maritime choke points are strategic vulnerabilities as much as strategic assets prompted significant responses. Saudi Arabia spent decades and billions of dollars building overland pipeline capacity specifically to hedge against the day when the Strait of Hormuz might be closed. The Saudi East-West pipeline was constructed in the early 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War, when tanker traffic through the Gulf came under threat for the first time in the modern era. This 5 million barrel per day pipeline could transport crude oil from eastern fields to Red Sea ports, bypassing Hormuz entirely. Similarly, the UAE developed a 1.5 million barrel per day pipeline linking its onshore oil fields to the Fujairah export terminal. The sheer scale of energy flowing through the Strait of Hormuz defies easy comprehension. In 2022, the strait's oil flow averaged 21 million barrels per day, equivalent to approximately 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. By 2024, flows through the strait made up more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade, cementing its position as the world's single most important oil passageway. The 39-kilometer strait at its narrowest point serves as the only route to the open ocean for over 1/6 of global oil production and 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas. These volumes cannot be easily redirected or replaced. Only Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates possess operating pipelines capable of circumventing the Strait of Hormuz, and even their combined capacity of approximately 6.5 million barrels per day represents less than 1/3 of typical strait throughput. The geographic constraints create inherent risks that no amount of planning can fully eliminate. Ships must navigate through designated shipping lanes just 3.2 kilometers wide, separated by a 3.2-kilometer buffer zone, threading through waters that vary dramatically in depth. While average depths reach around 70 meters and the deepest areas exceed 200 meters near the Musandam Peninsula, the shallowest navigational channel measures approximately 71 meters, requiring careful piloting of massive oil tankers. The economic implications of this geographic reality are staggering. While most oil transiting the strait is destined for Asian markets, Any disruption would have immediate global impact due to its effect on pricing. The market impact would be exacerbated because the vast majority of the world's spare crude oil production capacity is located in countries whose exports depend on transit through Hormuz. A significant spike in oil prices would be inevitable, and physical shortages would quickly develop if disruption were prolonged. Choke points like Hormuz are critical to global energy security precisely because they are narrow channels along widely used sea routes. The inability of oil to transit such a major choke point, even temporarily, creates substantial supply delays and raises shipping costs, increasing world energy prices with cascading effects throughout the global economy. Chapter 5: The 2026 Crisis and Collapse. The theoretical vulnerabilities of the Strait of Hormuz became devastating reality on February 28, 2026, when joint military strikes by the United States and Israel targeted sites in Iran. The Iranian response transformed the world's most important oil choke point into an impassable barrier almost overnight. Iran launched retaliatory attacks, and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz collapsed tanker transits by 92%, stranded 22% of the global fleet, and sent very large crude carrier rates more than doubling. By March 2026, threats and attacks by Iran on ships attempting passage led to a 97% drop in traffic, triggering the biggest disruption ever in the global oil supply. Oil markets reacted with unprecedented volatility. West Texas Intermediate crude oil prices spiked to $119 per barrel as traders recognized that approximately 20 million barrels per day of supply had been effectively removed from global markets. The surge in oil prices was accompanied by dramatic increases in the cost of other critical commodities, as transportation costs soared and energy-intensive industries faced supply constraints. The 2026 closure exposed the fundamental fragility of a global economic system dependent on a single narrow waterway. Despite decades of warnings and billions invested in alternative pipeline routes, the world remained critically vulnerable. The Saudi and Emirati pipelines, constructed specifically for such emergencies, could handle only a fraction of normal Hormuz volumes, leaving Asian economies scrambling for alternative supplies. Physical shortages developed rapidly as refineries depleted existing inventories. The crisis demonstrated that Iran's de facto blockade represented a broader strategic challenge. It showed how a single country could hold critical shipping lanes hostage and exert geopolitical pressure at relatively low cost. The ongoing disruption since February 2026 has forced a fundamental reassessment of global energy security, supply chain resilience, and the geopolitical architecture that has governed international shipping for decades. The immediate aftermath of Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz in late February 2026 sent shockwaves through global maritime networks with unprecedented speed and severity. Within days of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issuing warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, the world's most critical oil artery effectively ceased to function. The effective closure collapsed tanker transits by 92%, stranding 22% of the global fleet in a maritime gridlock of historic proportions. Very large crude carriers, the supertankers that form the backbone of international oil transport, saw their rates more than double as shipping companies scrambled to reroute vessels and assess their options. By March 2026, threats and attacks by Iran on ships attempting passage through the strait led to a 97% drop in traffic, representing the biggest disruption ever recorded in the global oil supply. The narrow shipping lanes, each just 3.2 kilometers wide and separated by a 3.2-kilometer buffer zone, which had once handled 20 million barrels per day, now sat virtually empty. Crude oil prices surged dramatically, with West Texas Intermediate crude spiking to $119 a barrel as markets reacted to the sudden disappearance of one-fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption from available supply. Asian markets, which received approximately 89% of the crude oil and condensate that normally passed through the strait, faced immediate shortages. The crisis extended beyond petroleum, with around one-fifth of global liquefied natural gas trade also cut off. Shipping companies, insurers, and energy traders confronted a scenario that had been theorized for decades but never fully materialized: the complete closure of the world's most important maritime choke point. Chapter 7: Anatomy of Vulnerability. As the crisis deepened, energy analysts and strategic planners conducted urgent assessments to understand the full scope of the disruption and identify potential solutions. The Strait's geography emerged as the central factor in the catastrophe. At its narrowest point, the waterway measured just 48 kilometers wide, with navigable channels even more constrained. The sheer volume of oil that had been exported via the Strait of Hormuz, combined with severely limited options to bypass it, meant that any disruption to flows would have enormous consequences for world oil markets. Analysts confirmed that a significant spike in oil prices was inevitable, and physical shortages would quickly develop if the disruption proved prolonged. The crisis revealed a harsh reality. Only Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates possessed operating pipelines capable of circumventing the Strait of Hormuz. Saudi Aramco operated the east-west crude oil pipeline with a capacity of 5 million barrels per day, while the UAE linked its onshore oil fields to the Fujairah export terminal with a 1.5 million barrel per day pipeline. Together, these alternatives could handle at most 6.5 million barrels daily, less than one-third of the Strait's normal 20 million barrel per day flow. Strategic experts noted that while most oil transiting the Strait had been destined for Asian markets, the impact was truly global due to immediate effects on pricing. The market impact was exacerbated because the vast majority of the world's spare crude oil production capacity had also been made unavailable, trapped behind the closed strait. Iran's de facto blockade highlighted a broader strategic challenge. It demonstrated how a single country could hold critical shipping lanes hostage and exert geopolitical pressure at relatively low cost. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz reverberated far beyond energy markets, reshaping global economic patterns and international relations in profound ways. Nations dependent on Persian Gulf oil faced immediate economic shocks as fuel prices skyrocketed and energy security became a matter of national survival rather than mere policy consideration. Asian economies, which had relied on the strait for nearly 90% of their Persian Gulf crude imports, implemented emergency rationing measures and activated strategic petroleum reserves. The crisis dominated international media coverage for months, with news outlets broadcasting images of massive tankers stranded at anchor, unable to complete their journeys. Public awareness of maritime choke points, previously an obscure topic confined to strategic studies, became mainstream knowledge as citizens worldwide confronted fuel shortages and price increases. The concept that narrow channels along widely used global sea routes could be critical to global energy security entered popular consciousness. Financial markets experienced extreme volatility, with energy stocks soaring while transportation and manufacturing sectors plummeted. Airlines cancelled routes, shipping companies suspended services, and industries dependent on petroleum feedstocks faced production halts. The crisis also sparked intense diplomatic activity, with international organizations and neutral nations attempting to mediate between Iran and Western powers. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which guaranteed transit passage through international straits, became the subject of heated debate as the international community grappled with enforcement mechanisms. Cultural narratives shifted as well, with the strait becoming a symbol of globalization's fragility and the interdependence of modern civilization. The realization that 1/5 of global oil consumption could be cut off by actions in a 48-kilometer-wide waterway fundamentally altered perceptions of energy security. Chapter 9: Reshaping Global Energy. The long-term consequences of the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis fundamentally restructured global energy infrastructure and strategic thinking about maritime security. Nations that had previously dismissed energy independence as economically inefficient now pursued it as existential necessity. Investment poured into alternative supply routes, with massive pipeline projects across Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East receiving accelerated approval and funding. The lesson that maritime choke points are strategic vulnerabilities as much as strategic assets had been relearned at enormous cost. Countries recalled that Saudi Arabia had spent decades and billions of dollars building overland capacity specifically to hedge against the day when the Strait of Hormuz might be closed, a foresight that now appeared prescient rather than paranoid. The crisis accelerated the global transition to renewable energy sources, as governments and corporations recognized that diversification away from petroleum reduced vulnerability to geopolitical disruptions. Naval doctrines worldwide underwent revision, with increased emphasis on protecting sea lines of communication and developing capabilities to ensure freedom of navigation through contested waters. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, operating from Bahrain, received substantial reinforcement, while other nations expanded their naval presence in the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea. International law governing straits and territorial waters faced renewed scrutiny and calls for reform. The fact that by 1972 the Strait of Hormuz had been completely closed by the combined 22-kilometer territorial waters of Iran and Oman, yet transit had continued based on customary practice, now seemed an inadequate foundation for global energy security. Economic models were revised to account for chokepoint risk, with the inability of oil to transit a major passage, even temporarily, now understood to create substantial supply delays, raise shipping costs, and increase world energy prices in ways that rippled through entire economies. The Strait of Hormuz endures today as both a testament to human civilization's dependence on maritime trade and a stark reminder of geopolitical fragility. The waterway that has existed for thousands of years, connecting the Middle East with India and serving as a center of maritime commerce since ancient times, continues to occupy a central place in global strategic consciousness. Modern navigators still traverse the same waters documented by historical figures like Babur, the first Padishah of the Mughal Empire, who recorded the importance of trade through Hormuz in his memoirs centuries ago. The strait's name, possibly derived from Ifra Hormizd, mother of King Shapur II of Persia, who ruled between 309 and 379 AD, connects contemporary crises to ancient heritage. The legacy of Portuguese control in the 16th century, when explorers first reached the Persian Gulf in 1507 and built a fortress on Hormuz Island to collect tolls from passing ships, echoes in modern attempts to control this strategic passage. The tanker war of the 1980s, when Iraq attacked Iran's Karg Island oil terminal in 1984, attempting to provoke closure of the strait, foreshadowed the 2026 crisis and demonstrated patterns of conflict that persist across decades. Today, the strait remains partially reopened under international monitoring, but the scars of 2026 have not healed. The passage that stretches approximately 167 kilometers in length, varying from 97 to 39 kilometers in width, with depths averaging 70 meters and exceeding 200 meters near the Musandam Peninsula, is now perhaps the world's most heavily surveilled waterway. Its significance transcends mere geography or economics. The Strait of Hormuz has become a symbol of how narrow passages can determine the fate of nations and how the free flow of commerce through international waters remains essential to global prosperity and peace.